Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is returning guest Kruptos. And in this conversation, we discuss his point of view that while the current regime, the technological regime of the modern state, or the total state, continues to progress and strip people of their individuality and their cultural connections, to dismantle that or to accelerate its demise is probably the worst possible scenario. And so being a Christian or being an authentic individual amidst this panoply of technocracy is a difficult proposition, but in his point of view, the best of all possible ways forward. You can find his work linked in the description. If you enjoy this content, consider liking, subscribing, and donating via the links below. Without further ado, here's Kruptos. Did you used to be a boxer?
No. No, I'm just, yeah.
You have this one unique...
like a scar there. Yeah, that's, I got, that was a pickup game of hockey, and I got hit with a stick in the face, 3 stitches.
Yeah.
So that was good.
Back when Canadians were men.
That's right. Yeah, and it was just a pickup game. We were at lunch, and we were all guys who actually played hockey. And so not having any equipment on, just doing it at lunch hour, because the school made an outdoor rink for us. And so no helmets. Guys would bring gloves because you don't want to get your knuckles bruised. You're much more likely to get your knuckles. But I had a friend of mine took a slap shot a little too close to me, and just on the follow through, caught me right in the forehead. Wow. And the worst thing is because your cells run this way and the cut was running this way. If it had run this way, you probably could have just pinched it up and closed it up and it would have been fine. But because it was vertical and it cuts against the sort of the grain of how your cells run, they had to stitch it because they said it would not close up on it. Otherwise, it wouldn't close up on its own. So, But yeah, it was only a tiny cut, like maybe a centimeter long, but 3 stitches it needed. It was bleeding like a pig too. It was brutal. I think I was in grade 7 or 8 at the time.
Wow.
Yeah. So back in the good old days when men were, like as you say, when men were men and you could, still do that sort of thing.
You know, I every passing day, I think it's more of a moral imperative for the United States to liberate Canada.
Oh my word. Yeah, there were some tweets of that today. It's just coming. But there's also the other interesting little side bit that they did polling, and apparently Canadians are less impressed with the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion than are Americans. That we only approve of it at a rate of 21%, and Americans, I think, are almost up around 40%. So we've basically seen multiculturalism up firsthand and gotten but the problem is that because of our relationship with our leadership class, it probably won't make a difference anyways, because Canadians are not by nature revolutionary people, right? So that's one of those things.
Yeah.
But we are, for those, and Americans often find this hard to take, but other than maybe the guns issue, that most Canadians, once they break free, can be a lot more quote unquote based than many Americans in many ways. It's just, it expresses itself weirdly because Canadians, I think, also tend to be more statist.
Yeah.
I wrote a paper on this in seminary, I think it was, on the difference in the understanding of the two systems. And Canada is what they call an in toto system, and Americans is an ex parte system. So in the States, you can really have, in a sense, populist movements bubble up more frequently because ideas are generally assumed to express themselves in the fringes, and then they build momentum and work their way up to the center. Right? And that comes back to the notion of federalism and stuff. So some of these things are culturally ingrained much more than, whereas in Canada, as a in toto system, ideas are typically expressed out of the center. So if you have a fringe idea, it really remains on the fringe. You sound like a petulant child sort of speaking to the broader consensus. So the idea is that if you want something to gain acceptance, you have to do it from within. And so the power structures that be control very much the narrative socially in many ways. So you have an elite class that expresses a certain range of political opinion, and anything outside of that political opinion is out of bounds. And then, so you don't really have populist parties in the same way that, and populist movements in Canada the same way you do in the States. So you'd really have to have it work up from the middle. And that's why really political parties in Canada are very much variations on a theme, even more so than the States. Like the Canadian Conservative Party is much more a sense of controlled opposition than even the Republicans in the US. So you just have, traditionally politics, has oscillated between one side or the other. And so you'll get 8 to 10 years of, the Liberals, and then you'll get 8 to 12 years of the Conservatives, and they just sort of basically pass the baton back and forth to each other. And generally, though, speaking, Canada has been more, quote unquote, liberal and statist since probably the late 1800s, early 19th century, or early 20th century, in part because of the influence of, say, the social gospel movement. And so you generally tend to get this idea, like you had in Europe, where that the state would become the vehicle by which we would instantiate the inbreaking of Christ's kingdom in that regard. So, you have the growing prosperity as, the 20th century emerges, and it becomes, beholden upon us as Christians to harness that and use it to solve all of the problems of mankind. So there's this melding of political liberalism with Christianity in a sense that was very optimistic. And you see that too in Europe with the social democrat movement and so forth. So there's a number, it just never really happened the same way in the States. I mean, there was some social gospel movement, but not really in the...
Is that significantly different from Christian nationalism as it's bandied about by Americans?
Okay, so yes and no. So I think that, yes, the impulse is very similar. I talked about this with the online figure Eugipius about Europe, that it's funny when people start talking about Christian nationalism. I said, well, you do realize that, those of us that come from overseas and still remember culturally some of what was happening there, that like a figure like, say, in the Netherlands, Abraham Kuyper, they were doing basically Christian nationalism, but 100 years ago, 120 years ago. So it's one of these things that it's happened before. It's not really a new phenomenon. And it's different in the way that it happens now. There was a much greater belief in broader liberal values like democracy and some of these sorts of things. But just people didn't want the revolutionary fervor that you found in France. So there was a sense of like, we want to stay away from revolutionary fervor, and yet still manage the state in an enlightened manner that embodies the best of sort of the emerging ideals of, sort of the modern age, but without the revolutionary fervor that you would find in France.
Well,
and so many people were, in a sense, not so much anti-liberal, but anti-revolutionary.
Yeah, okay. A large part of your work revolves around themes of technocracy and how, insofar as you try to manage the state actually manages you. And there was a thread that you posted, which caused me again to reach out to you about... it seemed kind of black-pilled or skeptical in nature about the possibility for Christians to either break free from or to manage the global managerial state, because we are so far beholden to it in every aspect of our lives that to try to break it down or to accelerate its fail state would just mean total disaster. So you have to kind of somehow allow it to wear Christianity as a skin suit while still being aiming yourself towards being a actual Christian and this Christianish beast.
Yeah. You're caught between a rock and a hard place. So I don't know whether I've talked about this with you so much, but there is, and you get this not just from Elul, but also from authors like Walter Ong. So I was encountering something very similar to this in Walter Ong's writing, where he examines the changes that writing and then print affected on the human consciousness, right? So, but Ong noticed, and here's the thing, is that once these, because you have to look at writing as a technology, right? Because you use tools to do it. You have the pen, the paper, and it changes the way you think about the world, because it takes words out of memory, puts them on the page, and allows you distances. It creates the idea of abstraction becomes much more possible when you have writing. So there's some other things, but going very back early to even to Plato, Plato was critical of the effects that writing was having on people, in a sense, the loss of memory and some of these other things. But it's telling that Plato used the medium of writing to offer his critiques. And so you then get the same thing with print, that if you're going to criticize print technology, you use print to do so. And in the same way, if you're going to criticize internet culture, you criticize Twitter and the effects of its life, well, what do you use to critique it? You use social media, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So now Elul will talk about this in The Political Illusion, that he says the idea that you have political choices is an illusion, that you have very, very limited choices in terms of your political options. So, for example, you might think that technology is terrible and we have to get rid of it, that, you know, assembly line production is awful and it's dehumanizing, and you may be right, you know what I mean, and the fact that the machines that you can make these are horrible and terrible for humanity. Like, nobody should be building tanks that can roll over the landscape of it, right? Yet nobody should be building tanks, like that kind of things. Yeah, nuclear weapons, that kind of stuff, right? But the problem is it's almost like Adam and Eve in the garden, is that once you've bitten from the apple and you now have knowledge of good and evil, there's no way to put that knowledge back in the bottle in that sense. So let's say you have this worldwide conversion or conversion. Everybody wakes up one day and realizes that, oh no, all of this stuff is horrible. Let's put it all away and let's once again live in a technological state where we've made it subordinate. We're going to get rid of assembly lines or whatever. The problem is that all of these tools and techniques, we embrace them in part because they give us a tremendous means to harness people, power, natural resources at scale, to accumulate power and money at scale. And once they're implemented, they do become this kind of like Nick Landian. They create a kind of they reach in a kind of an escape velocity where money and technology become their own morality. And so they become their own self-justifying morality. So the sense of, even if we say, hey, let's, descale the world, we're going to go back to it. The problem is that the knowledge is still out there. And so somebody's going to say, well, why did all these people stop building tanks? You know what? If all these like morons aren't going to build tanks, I'm going to build some tanks and I can rule the world. So there is this sense that you are forced to build tank. Once somebody builds a tank, if you want to maintain political sovereignty, you have to build tanks. And so this is kind of what I've euphemistically called the tank problem. And you see this everywhere in regard to technology, right? So the tank problem of Twitter is that you can't criticize social media without really using social media. And that's what Ong noted, is that to be on the cutting edge or to criticize the cutting edge of communication and these changes from print to the internet and social media and so forth, that in order to criticize these changes, in order to examine them, you have to use social media to do so.
Yeah. But
right?
so the point might not be to criticize in the sense of disrupting and dismantling and putting away or going back in any
Mhm.
substantial way, but rather criticism's true aim. Well, the only criticism that's going to last is that criticism which allows you to better use or to put in the proper place any given technology, right?
Well,
So it's not just
yeah,
it's
go
like
ahead.
internet, just how to use the internet is the purpose of criticizing internet use.
Yes, and so the key, I think the key understanding is that, and here's the thing that I think that people don't want to do, because we've always talked about, the free market, that we have to allow the market kind of to freely move around, do all these things. The same way you get with intellectual pursuits. So, you have in the university is supposed to be built on the cornerstone of free inquiry, right? And
Mm.
that's, the free exchange of knowledge, the marketplace of ideas. So you have the free exchange of ideas in that regard. But then also with technological development, you in many ways, is side along with science, in a sense. The free pursuit of knowledge also comes with the free pursuit of building technology. So how then do you restrain that? It really, in a sense, you either end up subordinating yourself to technology and money, and to, in some sense, the scientific endeavor, which Alul argues that science actually follows technology, not the other way around. People often look at technology as the instantiation of science, but it's actually technology that allows science to happen.
By creating better, quicker, faster, stronger tools, more subtler
Well, and also the
devices by
tools
which
to
to.
actually examine the world in the way that theory says that you should be able to examine it, right? So there's a lot of things in physics, for example, where people have come up with theories, but they don't have the devices to actually test them yet,
Mhm.
right? So that's where you get like these big particle accelerators or whatever, right? You can't do particle analysis without a particle accelerator. So there's a whole range of, and Alul goes through that. And so that, but the other thing is that technology is, of course, at its heart, a way of thinking about the world, that every solution is a technical solution. And so everything gets reduced to, how can we break this down, analyze it, abstract it, rationalize it, break the problem into its component parts,
Mhm.
then come up with a plan, a process, a set of policies, an institution that can then address this problem. And so that's
And
basically your one solution for everything. So, like, I think I've noted elsewhere recently that the one solution, like, you can't say, well, like, say the more religious one is to repent, right? Which we were just talking about. It's like what if we all got on our knees, sort of repented of technology, and that's just not allowed. Like, that's just not. So Alul calls this the unreason of technology, so that every technical problem must have a technical solution, because that's the only solution that's really allowed. So you solve the problems that are created with technology with more technology, and because every technology that's introduced it's ambivalent and brings both benefits and also trade-offs, problems, evils with it. You get the two together, that you never arrive at a state where you've eliminated all the problems. You never actually get to utopia. All you end up with is an ever increasingly accumulation of problems that basically begin to overwhelm the system until it collapses. And that's kind of, now that, not that Alul actually gets to sort of the collapsed hard sort of conclusions that way, but he comes close in a couple things. But if you read like authors like Tainter and so, like Joseph Tainter and so forth, like Tainter actually like draws it out explicitly, because Tainter doesn't talk about the technological society, but he talks about it more in terms of embracing complexity. That once that
yeah.
technology is a form of complexity, and once you embrace complexity to solve a social community's problems, that you are then committed to ever greater degrees of complexity to deal with the problems created by the first round of complexity.
And there's no way going back unless
No.
complexity ends up dumbing down people.
Yeah, the only real thing that, you end up with three options. At a certain point in time, what happens is, and you can track, and this is what the heart of Tainter's work is, that you can track almost mathematically the point at which the social inputs begin to outweigh the social outputs. And you can track it across all kinds of metrics, like, say, the number of engineers per patent, the number of, like, you go into the shipping administrator, the number of administrators per ships, these types of things. And you can see, as the system accumulates. He says at the beginning, there's massive gains that come from introducing complexity. And what happens is as you reach a certain point, those gains begin to diminish and you have to continue to put more and more effort. You need more and more administrators, more and more people involved in maintaining the system until you get to a point where one of three things typically happens. Either there's just kind of a gradual decline, a receding, right? Because you can no longer maintain the system. It just sort of gradually recedes to a point that you can maintain it. Yeah. The other is total collapse, where just within a span of a decade, and it's really, really short periods of time, like the civilization is just gone, right?
Is that analogous to what happened to the Soviet Union, or is that kind of a different?
We're talking more like the Mayans, perhaps, or other,
okay, yeah.
There's other
Bronze Age collapse.
I think he looks at like 5 or 6 different, and then you talk about like the way that Rome collapsed was very, very fast, right? Once you get, and he looked at the, in a sense, why did the barbarian attacks happen? And you can kind of track it. And he says almost by the time Rome collapsed, the periphery almost welcomed its collapse. We generally tend to think of it like, oh, it was a horror, but and so within 50 years, you go from the Roman Empire to basically the germ of feudalism within across the whole continent. And then the third option is that things would break up into the constituent parts. And Rome was kind of a combination of those two, of collapse and a breaking up into constituent parts.
More localized parts? Is that what you're talking about?
That's right. So back to a point where you can sustain life on a local level with local resources. Right. Yeah. So you're not drawing from. So, and that's really so. Now, in terms of dealing with the present moment, right? So part of the problem that you have with, and this gets into, say, Marshall McLuhan's observation of the medium is the message, is that the very nature of the administrative state is at its heart progressive. This is something also in a similar way that Schmidt noticed, that the parliamentary democracy as a system of modern parliamentary democracy as a system of government is not neutral. We generally tend to think of the administrative state and parliamentary democracy as empty vessels that we then fill with political content.
And eventually this neutral reason, rationality will alleviate all differences.
And it'll direct the system in regards to different policy measures. But when you look at it, and you look at it through the lens of sort of the technological or through technique, and you begin to examine it, you begin to realize that the administrative state itself has a kind of telos, that it's the application of technique and technology to the problems of society and to managing society's affairs. So in this regard, it embraces the technical mindset of continual improvement. So the idea is, you talk about a plan. So we have a problem, we're going to solve it administratively. We build an institution, we get out there, we work at it. Then we realize it's not quite fixed. So we examine the problems again, go back to the drawing board, readjust the policies and so forth, maybe add some people here or there, we tweak it. And the idea is that if we keep iterating this again and again, eventually we reach a point where all of the problems are solved. So in this regard, the very telos of the administrative state is itself progressive. And this is also the case, you might even argue, with any modern institution that works on the basis of, policy structure, board structure, that type of thing, where you have, where it's a policy framework designed to supersede the participants in the institution, that the institution, like institutions themselves, are inherently liberal in nature because of this, now, and this is where conquest laws come in, right?
Yeah. Just one second, because this is a really big problem with political discourse. What do you mean by progressive? You mean there's a line, but what do you mean by liberal? You're not talking about like property rights, but you're talking about some sort of view of man as a rational actor that can be cogged in the machine.
Yeah, so it's in a sense the big idea of what we would call human progress. So that and all of these pieces come together, like the Enlightenment idea of, free inquiry, the marketplace of ideas, all of these, what we would call liberal cornerstones. democratic institutions, in a sense, dialogue as the
cumulative knowledge.
Yeah, but dialogue is the pursuit of truth, as instantiated in the parliamentary mechanism. So that we meet together and we discuss things, and as we do so, we as a people will get ever closer to the truth. And he says that's really and that was Schmidt's argument of sort of this is what's happening in a parliamentary institution. And then he sort of picked it apart, and that's why the real value of Schmidt is in how he picks that apart and all of its flaws and so forth. Yeah. So, and really, what's at work in this nature of the institutions and their idea of continuous improvement, iterative improvement, is that as you move forward, they're getting continually better and better. They work better and better. And that's kind of the idea of the systems. And this is why Conquest's law is that, any institution that is not explicitly conservative eventually ends up drifting leftward, because it wants to embrace that mentality that we can solve all of our problems through institutions. So this gets us back to like sort of my thread then, is that inherently there is no such thing as conservative politics, right? Because if you embrace the idea of we have to put it into policy, that's not an inherently conservative idea. So in this sense, but it gets back to that thing, sort of what we were talking about with social media. Unless you literally want to blow the whole system up, bring us back to the dark ages and so forth, you're sort of left with the system that we have. Now, I'm not a revolutionary, and I don't think people should be revolutionary. The billions must die is not a tenable position. So in this regard, my case has always been conservatives should be doing two things. The system as it is eventually going to collapse, fracture, pull back, or whatever. There's going to be an opportunity for those who want to live a more traditional conservative way of living to create opportunities for them to build parallel societies that then could potentially form the core of a new polity as the current order fractures. So that's the one piece there. But in the meantime, we still have to live in the current order. So, and there's value in living with the current order. So Trump moves into office, right? Mm-hmm. There's real value in us embracing the current order and trying to gain benefit for us and our people. So in a sense, the whole idea of like loot the treasury to support people in parallel communities. So, these types of things, right? So you're building that kind of power, to try these experiments. Well, why not? These sort of things. But I said, like, in order to do this, you have to understand that you're playing in somebody else's sandbox. So what this means is that you're then caught in sort of the tank problem again, is that you have to take ways of life, patterns of belief that are fundamentally alien to the modern system and really don't translate. So what you're going to do is take the ideas of a faith-based type of thing or traditional ideas, and you're going to abstract them, rationalize them, turn them into policy, which in effect destroys them because they're no longer the same thing here. But it's a necessary thing that you have to do in order to work within the current system as it is with its current telos, because the system itself is fundamentally at a structural, hardwire, base programming level, is liberal and progressive, and it's built around the idea of human progress. So you're in a sense going to have to take conservative ideas and translate them into a progressive environment, which essentially destroys them as destroys them. But in a sense, you're doing the best you can. Like, you've got to build tanks because this is what you've got to do, but you've got to find a way to build tanks in a way that doesn't rob you of your humanity and doesn't fundamentally destroy your faith. And that's really the challenge that you have ahead of us. And it's one that we've done very poorly, because if you look at the split between left and right, there really is no conservative politics in the United States. It's just variations on liberalism. It's fast liberalism and slow liberalism. Yeah. And nobody has really done conservative politics in a modern technological environment. Well, okay, they have, where they've technologized traditional values and implemented them politically. But like we're not allowed to talk about. Yeah, well, but it's because you're looking at, say, something. I mean, probably the examples would be Franco Spain, might be your best example, or say you know, Germany in the early 20th century. But that's not a Christian environment, right? But Franco's Spain is maybe perhaps your best environment or your best example. However imperfect, you know, Franco's Spain worked out. And you can see the effects that, because when Franco's Spain ended up collapsing by Americans' help, that it really wasn't able to. Once Franco's regime collapsed, the flip back to sort of extreme liberalism was quick and blunt in that regard, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they went another example might be Quebec, Canada's Quebec in the early part of the 20th century. That when Quebec in the 60s, when things broke, when the church lost its grip on Quebec society, it flipped into liberalism very, very quickly. So Quebec in the province of Quebec in Canada might be another example of that type of environment where you've, in a sense, a politicized Christianity. But what the problem is with a politicized Christianity is it ends up emptying it, instrumentalizing the faith. And the problem is that the moral demands that the Christian faith places upon people really don't work unless you really actually believe. That just instrumentalizing them as good ideas isn't really a long-term sort of plan to do things. People have to actually believe in them.
That's kind of how you get to woke, is
in some ways, yes. Yeah, and it to wokeness, or just the abandonment of faith altogether, because you've instrumentalized it. Now,
yeah, you don't need it anymore.
That's exactly it. And that's kind of what happened in Europe. So by instrumentalizing the faith, taking it out, and we're going to now solve poverty, solve all these issues. We're going to immanentize the eschaton. We're going to help the Lord bring about, the return of Christ, the 1,000-year reign. It's going to happen here within history. We're going to do that as God's servants. And then when we sort of reach that zenith, Christ's return, and we can hand it over to God and sort of move into the next life. And I mean, I know that's kind of a crude characterization of it, but there was a lot of well-meaning people. That's really what they thought they were doing. They were helping God instantiate the new heaven and the new earth here on earth. And on the ascendant side of civilization, it makes a lot of sense. Right. So we talk about, we mentioned that point, from Tainter's work and embracing complexity. All this. So when civilization is on its ascendant and there's extra resources and all these things, how they came into those ideas, it makes a lot of sense at the time. Now we look back and think, well, that was ludicrous what they were doing. But and the effect it had on sort of emptying out the faith and sort of making it irrelevant in people's lives. You can see that how it played out, but at the time, these people were very, very sincere about it. There were very few bad actors in that regard. They genuinely believed in what they were doing. Now we're in a point where, Christians are looking at society on the downside of Western civilization and saying that, we have in the Christian faith traditionally a bunch of tools here that we think could help society, which means in that regard, imposing the Christian faith or its morality upon society. Now, this gets you into a kind of a murky area, well, not murky, but a disputed area, shall we say, among those within the Christian community. So there's those who believe that the only proper way to do the Christian faith is to convert people from below, one by one, so forth. But there's those who, like myself, who look at history and say, the gospel was never spread one. I mean, there's some one by one by one by one. But if you look honestly at the majority of how these things happened, you would convert the head of a household and the whole household became Christian. You converted the barbarian king, and all of a sudden all his people were Christian. That type of idea. And so people were generally converted from the top down. And if you look at how cultural formation works, generally people take their cues from their social elites, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea is that if Christians ascend into the position of social elites and are society's tastemakers, there's going to be some of the work will be done by people just adapting to the new power regime, shall we say.
Yeah.
And the rest of it is then just formalizing that power regime into law.
Yeah.
Right. So
The,
it's not a matter where you have to like impose these things jackboot on people. People will just begin to realize that, oh, acting like a Christian is in my social and economic well-being. And then eventually what happens is the line between acting like a Christian for social and economic well-being and actually being a Christian for a significant portion of the society becomes a sort of a non-existent distinction.
does it have to be Christian? Can it be at any given highly moral and theologically integrated ideology?
Well, and this is where we get back to the point of where belief has to be genuine, right? So, like, for example, the current reigning, what I would call religious impulse in society is this belief in human progress, that we as human beings can save ourselves and bring about our own utopia. So that's the current, and even for many Christians, and this is, one of the steps, if you have to really hold the mirror up, that many of us as Christians also have a belief in human progress. And so that is really the great impulse that has driven us as a culture since probably the middle of the 1700s. And it's only grown recently. Now, in terms of the question, well, could it be Buddhism? Could it be Hinduism? Could it be Islam? In theory, it could be. But if you're talking about a Western problem and Western culture, it really is, Christianity is the Western religion. So that it's the question of, is human progress going to ascend, or is Christianity going to reassert itself once again as this society's dominant religion? Now, I suppose, but see, if Islam were to take over, it would be a conquest. Whereas if Christianity were to reassert itself, it would be a reform and a sense of return. So that's, I think, so, and this is why I said too, that, like when you look at the position that the state has taken in the life of the people, the modern administrative state, it really becomes the what do you call it, the being within which we live and move and have our being. So it takes on almost a divine character. So really what you have within the West is a conflict of gods, a religious conflict between the state and, the Christian God, the triune God worshipped by Christians. So you really have a conflict of gods. And I think that's why, and I wrote about this a couple of years ago, that ultimately I think this is why the political battles in the West are eventually going to become, and it's sort of, I think, destined to be this way, religious battles. That it's just because society at its core needs a great religious impulse. And if it isn't human progress, what will it be? Mm-hmm. And in the West, the thing closest at hand is the embers of Christianity. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the argument that I make in that regard. I don't think, in a sense, I don't think like Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so forth are really adaptable to, in a sense, the Western soul in that regard. And you're not going back to pagan religions like that predated the Christian. That's just not happening either. That's sort of a LARP. So that's kind of where, that's the case I made. In theory, I could be wrong, I guess, but that's kind of how I see it playing out.
I want to offer you an idea that I've been thinking about, and it's very similar to your tank problem, but it hits closer to home. It's more like the Costco problem. It's like everything that makes Costco what Costco is can be found in Nazi Germany, like this highly competent managerialism of like massive amounts of people. You instead of like killing the undesirables, you turn the pigs into $3 hot dogs or whatever it is, right? And it could be, I mean, we want some sort of, well, on an aesthetic level, a certain amount of people will kind of grow up in the mall culture, grow up going to supermarkets, and then they'll take a break for a while. It's like watching TV and being used to commercials and then not watching TV and like seeing commercials again. Like, this is really offensive. After not being in Costco for a while, you walk into Costco and like, this is really dehumanizing. Like everything, including me, is just a product being shuffled around. And, but at the same time, a Costco organizes life and feeds the wife specifically, which then it gratifies the wife. It allows the wife to access goods and to live kind of cheaper and like manage the household much better. You could probably see in Costco like a fiefdom of somebody with something approaching Christian values. Like, I'm going to treat my workers well, and I'm going to demand of my customers that they pay this nominal fee and behave in this certain way, so that it doesn't turn into Walmart. It doesn't turn into a place where I need to lock everything up. Like, there's this reinstitution of something approaching classical high trust American values in the Costco. And it was kind of carved out by this guy's highly managerially competent, but he still had some sort of spark of humanity or humanism in him that kind of created a feedback loop that you could say God smiled on him, right? In kind of a mythological way, right? So the Costco problem is very similar to the tank problem, but it's not about killing people. It's about besting the market. It's kind of like the flip side of this managerial technocratic thing. It's the opposite of the Holocaust or Nazi Germany, right? Because it's built to serve. But it does all the same tools.
I hear what you're saying. It's it's in a sense of recognizing that you can commodify the idea of a high in-group preference. So how do you artificially, through technique, create a high in-group preference? Is you have a membership fee, right? And so the membership fee becomes your entry into a high in-group preference. And like my wife and I were talking about it, I said, the fact that he got away with this is just, and continues to get away with it, is just crazy. And is very open about it, that, yeah, we don't offer like certain discounted, like none of the stuff. And I've said to my wife that it's, I don't know if you remember, I don't know if you guys had like buy-way stores. They're like, like Kmart, but it's like Kmart for upper middle class people.
Like a Target.
And, yeah, but it's even more so than Target. But like, because and against, not anybody can go in there. You don't have to do like the dollar store items, that type of thing. You can just, all of the products are about maintaining the perception of an upper middle class lifestyle, without the added fees of actually buying, high-end goods. That you can give the perception of buying high. But again, it's creating that high-end group preference with a product thing. I can see what you're saying there, though, that you can come up, and even in a sense, the ethics of how you pay your workers, like sort of the Christian idea of a just price and a just wage, these types of things that are long-standing, which run very counter to the impulse to constantly be lowering wage costs and to constantly be lowering prices, that there is and that there's a just price to pay for your vegetables, and cheap vegetables may not necessarily be the world's best thing. But what was interesting when you mentioned it made me think, when you said that, the Nazification, but when you look at the three major ideologies of fascism, liberalism, and socialism, communism, that all three of them are in essentially progressive ideologies. And I think that's often mistaken with fascism or Nazism, is that people look at it as
regressive,
anti-modern, but it is progressive, because you're taking the older ideas of society, but you're putting them into a modern progressive type. Like, I mean, the fact that you're using that they use propaganda tells you that's a technologizing of, so you take all of these older, national myths. So, but the progression there is not for humanity, but for this particular people group. So, what else is the 1,000-year Reich but a kind of, we're going to establish a utopian realm by conquering the world with our superior technology and tactics. And then we're going to create, breathing room for ourselves, the Lebensraum, and so you can see in the vision, it just from the way that it's been characterized in the latter half of the 20th century as anti-progressive. You're like, well, no, it's actually just another form of progressivism. It's just uses as its substrate, as its material. So instead of it's sweeping away the present to instantiate an idealized past, but that idealized past is newly instantiated technologically,
Yeah.
and not
Through the
organically.
tools of the present. Yeah. So
That's right.
in that, you bring up those three, and this is kind of whiff of Dugan, perhaps, is liberalism the best way forward for Christianity? To just kind of ride that particular multicultural tiger in a way?
For now, I think, because that's what like I say, unless you really want to go the route of, so you're doing two things at once, I would argue. You're trying to grapple with the system as it is and recognizing that there's a certain cost to you and your faith in doing so. And the other is to begin to say, how do we govern ourselves and live life as a people and grapple with the knowledge of technology in a way that's perhaps even, what we say, non-ideological? I think prior to the rise of ideology, governance didn't, and this is the point that Schmidt makes, governance wasn't really ideological. And this is the point of the concept of the political, is that it was really about sort of what's best for me and my people. Mm-hmm. And then you're managing much more in the idea of just letting quality people lead and govern rather than putting systems in place. And you're letting quality people then make wise decisions in the moment. So you have men of quality, men of wisdom who are put into positions of leadership, and then they lead and make judgments and decisions. And so when somebody switches, maybe the way you do things changes with the next guy who's in power, or who's in this position of authority, but he has real authority and he leads with real, and that's an older way of looking at it. But the question is how do you then do those two things of looking at a more humane, different way of dealing? Because I mean, the reason why that was eliminated is because people are of varying quality. So I mean, the technological system promised that you could squeeze out all the variance out of the system and produce consistent results, which is true, it does. And so you get to raise the floor of your outcomes, but the cost of raising the floor of those outcomes is you also shave off all the highs. Mm-hmm. So the system really resists men of quality who are exceptional people, because the system wants to operate within that very mediocre band of consistent outcomes.
That's my old kind of criticism of that. It was popular 5 years ago. We don't want equality of outcomes. We want equality of opportunity. But to ensure equality of opportunity, you have to treat everybody the same. So you end up with the equality of outcomes just in the beginning. It's just like, okay, we're just going to educate them, right? And then try to figure out that it's the same thing.
And most people don't realize that the modern idea of the meritocracy, a technologized version of the meritocracy, where you do IQ tests, recruit the best people, blah 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 blah, that system was put in place largely to undermine the older form of the inherited nobility, right? Because you had these people coming up in the merchant classes who were smart, successful, and they looked at
proved themselves.
They looked at the titled nobility and said, why are we ruled by this inconsistent? Yeah, some of them are fine, but for the most part, the quality is not there. So if we sweep them away, we can instantiate a new system of government that is better, and that's really, in a sense, where the U.S. Constitution is sort of one of these first forms of this types of things. So you sweep away the old nobility, you put in place, what's the phrase in the Constitution? The preamble is a better way. There's that a more perfect union. That's, I think, the word they use, a more perfect union. So we're going to instantiate a more perfect union. But there's this idea that we can correct the flaws of ambitious men by means of system. And that's, in a sense, the heart of the U.S. constitutional order, is that we can, by playing ambitious men off against each other within a system, we can allow the system to constrain that to create, in a sense, good
Yeah,
outcomes.
but so I think that is where you kind of get a glimpse of how liberalism is at fault for where we are now. When you release that, when you shirk the nobility and you hand it off to a bunch of lawyers who have already proved themselves, you have a tremendous amount of
business
energy.
managers.
Yeah,
lawyers and
you have a
business
tremendous
managers.
amount of efficiency that hits the system right away, and you have this big spike.
That's right.
But then the system
Exactly.
doesn't create or starts to shelter the Darwinian selection process by mediocratizing everybody in the wake of that system, so that it doesn't refresh itself with new nobility, it doesn't refresh itself with new elite. And then the people who goes up, it resists that because the bureaucratization starts to select mediocre people, start to hire more mediocre people than them because of human nature.
And the system is actually designed, when you're looking for, especially as equality of opportunity collapses into equality of outcome.
Yeah.
That, because in theory, if everybody is equal, right? And that's, I guess, the thing is, if you say, well, everybody's not equal, then you're not really in a liberal, But once you begin to say that all men are born equal, that in theory, if everybody has equal opportunity, then you should, in theory, have equal results across society, right? In that regard. But the problem is they don't work out. So then so now we have to say something must be wrong in the system. We have to manage the outcomes.
Yeah.
That's where the logic of that goes, right?
Yeah.
But so
because it's absolute anathema. And I, you know what, even as skeptical as I am of liberalism, I am a liberal, and it's very, very difficult for me to be at peace with seeing people as not equal. I mean, I can see, some people are prettier and some people are uglier, some people are stupider, some people are funnier. Like there's that, but like to really go back to that pre-modern point of view, it's like I can't really get there. That's really...
Well, for a lot of us, I mean, even for somebody like myself who on an intellectual level has made the arguments and gotten there, you still find on a day-to-day basis that you're far more, like most of us just have no idea just how liberal we really are, right? You find yourself that you treat everybody the same anyways, right? Really, like, why should I treat everybody the same? These types of things. It's just little stuff like that. But the system itself is actually designed to prevent men of quality from arising because they're inherently dangerous. Now, this is a thesis that gets put forward in Ellul's propaganda, and he doesn't delve into it a lot. But if we understand that the leadership qualities of a true elite as being the tastemakers of society, right? So they're the ones that provide the religious, spiritual, moral, all that type of guidance. They're the exemplars of who our society is, right? The true nobility. Once you cut that off and managerialize everything, what Ellul argues is that the role that the elite used to play is now filled in by propaganda. So that what he argues in a sense is that we have no leaders in our society, only managers.
Only lobbyists, yeah.
Yes, they're just managers. Now, you can say, well, what about guys like Zuckerman or Elon Musk or whatever? And I said, you have more successful managers and less successful managers. And some of these folks will exhibit the qualities of old school leaders. It's just hard because they're human beings. It's hard not to, to have charisma and force of character. Like people will emerge that have these qualities, but you can see the freak out when people with these qualities begin to emerge. It's almost like they have to be cut down and put in their place because the system doesn't want, because the men of quality and men of charisma and who just make things happen are indictment on the system itself in that regard. So you have to cut them away, get rid of them. And the idea is that propaganda fills the role of the leader and we are left with like managers. Now, what happens is when you get into a crisis like COVID and you need somebody to step up and make decisions and actually lead, is that you look around, you go like, nobody's in charge. And that's when people, I think, began to find, for a lot of people, they first began to see during COVID, like we have like, okay, who put all these managers in charge? Nobody elected them. Yet they're running things and they're imposing like totalitarian controls on our lives. Nobody elected them. They're managing you. And like, who is this? Like all of a sudden they found themselves in front of microphones, this, senior VP of the health unit or whatever. And now he's he's the one making decisions. None of our elected officials. And it really exposed the system. And then all of a sudden you start reading somebody like Carl Schmitt and you talk about the exceptional. And you realize that when the true exception event happens, these managers are not going to be able to deal with it, because the true exception event requires somebody of that exceptional charisma, character, or maybe not character, but like the force of personality. Because I mean, it could be a totally bad dude. Many leaders are, right? But they have the force of personality to take the system by a hold and remake it after themselves, right? And that's and our system is designed to prevent that type of person from emerging. And that's what says people say, well, we need to get back to the meritocracy. And they're like, well, okay, you do realize that to get back to a meritocracy, you would have to basically break up the West, right? Like you're talking like one of those collapse scenarios, because you would have to break it up into its constituent parts again to allow these people to get into a social situations or create the situations where they can emerge and so forth. So like, we're not getting back to the meritocracy. It's just not happening. Like I have a piece that's coming up where I'm going to make that argument.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, without without faith, of course we couldn't. But I mean, just if Donald Trump, I don't even know what he's going to do, but if Donald Trump gets in there and let's just say he somehow just disbands the Department of Education, hundreds of thousands of teachers are going to be out of a job. Thousands upon thousands of administrators are going to be out of a job. And then a bunch of kids are just going to be walking around, and maybe the state will pick up the slack, or the states will pick up the slack. Right. But that whole system, like, what are all those people going to do? And you actually have to have faith that kids have an ingrown need to prove themselves and an inborn need to be curious, and that they'll find some sort of discipline, and they'll find that which the Department of Education was not delivering them outside of that system that completely controls them and picks them up and drops them off and feeds them and connects them with all these opportunities, mediocre though they be. Without a sense of faith in human capital, there's no way that system's going to really be broken up.
No, and the other thing is, and here's, I think the thing that people, and this is part of that thread that I wrote, is people don't really think about this whole getting rid of the Department of Education. Yeah. There are a number of federal government bureaucracies that are completely unnecessary. You don't really need them. You could, in theory, you could get rid of them. But the problem is that when you run, now, the United States is like a continent-wide country of 350 million people. Not really a country per se, but it's an empire, right? A continent-wide empire. But once you scale a society up to that level, that power wants to accumulate centrally. And in order to scale things up to that level, you need, in order to make it happen, and this is one of the things you talk about in business, you go from an owner operator, and every time that you scale up the business to a different level and a different size, you also need at the same time to transform the way that it's run to enable the greater scale. Because you can use command and control up to a certain point where you issue orders, things happen. Yeah. But once you as a business leader, you get to a certain point, now you could be a single owner, but in order to, say, scale a business up to a certain size, you have to be able to issue commands, set policy that is then carried out across the organization. Now, you can't control, at a certain point in time, you can't control anymore directly how that policy is implemented across every department in the business. You can try, but at a certain point in time, people will take those things, they'll do it, and you're basically relying on people understanding the culture of the business, understanding the intent of the policies to make it work. And that's how it works politically across. So one of the things is to scale the country as a country, like the United States, up to what it is. It wants to centralize, and it also wants to standardize everything in order to make it work. So in order to make a national economy work, you have to standardize all kinds of things. And in standardizing, then, okay, sure, you could have standardization organization. Maybe you don't need a department as big as the current education department, but you need some groups that then set standards. This is like the kind of joke, like, well, why can't the West just let Haiti fall into sort of becoming like a third world country? Well, because Haiti is under the purview of the West. And so it has to then sort of maintain a certain level of political organization. Just, you can't allow it to, in the same way too, you can't allow the schools in West Virginia and Mississippi to fall below a certain level of standard. They have to be kept up to a minimum, and that's the sense.
So even if you have to lower the standard, they're going to meet it.
That's right. And you need a national centralized standard for everybody, because how do you set the standard for Mississippi and West Virginia? Well, you have to have a standard for everybody. And well, how do you manage a standard for everybody? You have to have a centralized Department of Education to establish and manage those things. People sort of say, well, you don't need this. No, of course you don't need the Department of Education, just like you don't need a whole bunch of other departments. But the internal logic of the technical system that allows you to manage the United States at a scale of 350 million people across a whole continent will demand something like the Department of Education. And this is part of what the thread's saying, is that it's there. So, okay, so now that the Department of Education is there, and unless you're willing to break the United States up into like multiple pieces where every state is sort of its own actual state, like as a state, and then you're kind of stuck with the education. You kind of need it as a necessity of the system. So if you need it as a necessity of the system, if you're going to take power and assume power, rather than saying, oh, we need to get rid of the Department of Education, you need to have a plan of how are we going to use the Department of Education to take these abstracted, rationalized conservative values and impose them on the country. And how are you going to put your people in charge of these organizations so that when you're out of office, your legacy as a ruling party sits around for a lot longer than what you currently are? And if you can't do that, you're not really serious. And that's, I think, what a lot of people say are still of this mindset that, well, we need to get rid of the Department of Education because we don't need the department. No, you don't need the Department of Education. Of course you don't need the Department of Education. But you do, or you need something like it, if you're going to maintain the United States as a continent-wide country of 350 million people which requires an administrative state to run. So fill it, use it, put your people in there, and create within this sort of basic liberal system. You can create multi-generational legacy for yourself of patronage, of people. So you get your people in place, your patronage, your policies in place. And once they're dug in, then it's going to take the next administration, when it flips back to the Democrats, the Liberals, Progressive, whatever again, if it flips back in 50 years, whatever, when it flips back, it becomes much, much more difficult to dislodge you and your power record, because you're basically the people, the policies, everything. And you're the way things are doing the present order. And that's really what we face right now in terms of the Republicans coming in, is they're facing that machinery that has to then be cleansed, rethought, and so forth, all the way through from top to bottom. And, the typical idea that, well, we need to make it smaller. Okay, idea, yeah. Smaller government is always ideal, but the problem is with smaller government is that you can't run the United States at scale with a smaller government. It's just, well, we did it back in the 1700s. Yeah, but the 1700s, you were still on the ascendancy of Western culture. And so you're gaining the benefits from complexity there. We're in a very different historical position right now. So you don't have the benefit of being on the ascendant and gaining all of that easy access, or all of those easy returns from embracing complexity on the way up. Right. So that's kind of where we're at now today. So, and this is kind of the frustrating thing when you're dealing with, I know, frustrating, but a lot of people, just because they don't understand, how it works at a base level, then they're basically allowing the programming that they've had, their Tea Party program, the other things, and they're not, in a sense, shifting gears to what does it mean to manage the United States as it is, as, first of all, a continent-wide empire, a global empire, and to manage it at scale from a conservative point of view, conservative position. And I don't think a lot of people have actually really thought about that, to be honest with you, because they basically just have been going back to these old defaults. So we just need to get rid of the Fed, get rid of the Department of Education, and we'll be all fine. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. Sorry.
Can that which is conservative operate at scale?
Well, no, technically it doesn't. It's no longer conservative anymore, right? So
Yeah.
that's the thing.
So
And that's the thing is that you destroy conservatism
ultimately
by making.
yeah. So ultimately, the only solution that I'm hearing here, the only final solution I'm hearing here is deal with that at scale problem and descale humanity back to a more manageable conservative.
Well, here's the thing: is that you use the scale that you have right now to. It's almost kind of like. Do you remember the management guy Tom Peters,
No.
Liberation Man? He did a lot on talking about this problem of revitalizing large corporations. And so he would, one of the things that they looked at was, say, like the Skunks Works in Lockheed Martin. So Lockheed Martin, big bureaucratized corporation, but what you do is you create this little unit with inside here, the Skunk Works, and you protect them from management, you protect them from policy, you give them money and resources, and you just let them cook. So basically, that's in a sense, I think, really what the mandate is for, at least the way I would see it, for something like a Trump, is to use the mechanisms of state to create a whole bunch of conservative skunk works on the ground, parallel political structures that that we're able to build now, laboratories, and do that using the mechanisms of the empire. And so that way you can build the social equivalent of the that supersonic spy plane, the Blackbird or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm just drawing blank.
SR-71.
And SR-71. Yeah. So you can, in a sense, but the kind of social equivalent of a community that is genuinely conservative, but you're doing it sort of under the radar, protected by the federal government.
Yeah.
In that regard, but just allowing people to have access to some resources they might not otherwise, give them almost like you think like the South African community of Oranje. You give them a charter to just where they're free from some of the normal political constraints in a community, and they're just allowed to kind of do their thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's kind of. I mean, we're just basically. I mean, this is just spitballing stuff, right? But
yeah,
I think this is the kind of ideas that. Our people have got to sort of look at, and then the other thing is, doing your best to instantiate it. Like, how hard, banning pornography.
It comes down to,
these types of things, right? Banning pornography, right? These are things that could be done and they'd be immeasurably good for society.
Yeah. It takes kind of, I guess it kind of takes two types of faith. I was thinking about the Civil Rights Act. I don't think that America needs it anymore.
It should be gotten rid of anyways. It's a terrible. Yeah.
Well, it's not. That's the Constitution, and we're, like all this talk about like how great the Constitution is. Like our real Constitution is the Civil Rights
Absolutely.
Act. But you can make a moral case that we don't need that anymore. There was an intervention where the state took on way more responsibility for its citizens than we ever intended or wanted, and look what it's done. And you can make like a case like we don't look what has it actually done for us. And then secondly, like we don't need that anymore. We don't. People are fine freely associating. We're not going to have a race war. It's not really in the cards. We don't need this whole apparatus that's going around and punitively forcing people to associate with each other, even if they don't want to, for the good of humanity or whatever, right? But it takes faith in human beings to not revert to this kind of tribal thing. On the one hand, if you're talking about, but on the other end, then you have patronage where the state or somebody uses the apparatuses of the state somehow to ban pornography or to make it very difficult to access, let's say. At least, and then what's that going to do? Like, at least, like have some sort of age verification. That is limiting people's freedom. That's not trusting people to make the right decisions, right? So that's the other side of trusting government, trusting authority.
The thing is, and here's the challenge that you face, is that to build mass society, you have to destroy the organic functions of local community. And one of the in a sense, the pitches that was given for letting people in a sense, the good that you get out of having your local community destroyed is that you can ditch those smothering, communities where everybody's in your business and they're all, they're moralistic and, but all the things that made communities what they were, we get rid of all of that. But the problem is, if you're going to maintain social order, somebody has to, that order has to be created somewhere. So it's either created organically at the level of the community, or the state then fills in that role. And we're now at the point where, 3 generations after those communities were undermined, that we're now at the point where we're seeing the level of social breakdown where the state has to step in and assume the role that the kind of license that we've allowed people in the name of freedom is sort of unusual in the long course of history and unsustainable. And so the sense of either you go back to small communities again, or you're left with the position that the state has to step in and fill that role. Yeah, and that's kind of where we're at. Yeah.
Well, that's where you get women's rights, the whole thing. Like if you had people locally bound in marriage contracts, like the state just backs up a marriage contract. Once you loosen those bonds and then loosen the contractual agreements and make it, and it's not, the burden is kind of on women in this example, but then eventually now women have to sue the state for resources, or, and by sue the state, I mean ask from the state for protections from these so-called trans women coming into there. So like the women need the state because now they don't have anything else to rely on, but now everybody's vying for the state to back up their own and wants, needs, rights, whatever.
Well, and the impulse of you might say like mass democracy is very similar to this, right? Because you think to yourself, and this is some of the things that people don't often think about, right? So how do you as a politician get elected? Well, you go out to the people and you take a temperature of what their needs, what their wants are, and you see this. What's the priorities of issues in that regard? And so, you as a politician say, "Hey, if you elect me, I'll address X, Y, and Z." Right. So now, you elect me, and I go into politics, and we put in place some bureaucratic institutions, process, procedures to address those issues. Right now, my competitor wants to get elected. What does he do? Well, he goes back to you and promises something else. And what ends up happening, the impulse of mass democracy, is that eventually you end up being involved in every aspect of your citizen's life because you have to for the exigencies of acquiring and maintaining power. So the natural outcome of mass democracy ends up being totalitarianism. And there's no real, because that's just sort of if you look at the nature of how the system works, that's just kind of you set yourself on the path of that's how it's just going to go, because it's just sort of the demands of getting elected, staying in office or whatever. You have to address the needs of the people. And by addressing the needs of the people, you're involved in the lives of the people, and you have to find new needs to address and so forth and so forth and so forth. And so people have observed that the older hierarchical systems where there was no such thing as like the state, and you just had a handful of people that kind of managed loosely certain key affairs of governance in a society, that for the most part, organically, most of the day-to-day running of society was taken care of on the local level by the people themselves, for the large part. But I mean, those old communities that were very suffocating, technology. Right?
Yeah, well, it's suffocating, and then prior to technology.
I mean, people. Okay,
I guess it's not the Costco problem. It's the Costco test. Can you get to a wholesome community conservative lifestyle at scale with the same convenience and emulation of high trust as a Costco? Can you have feudalism in Costco, right?
Costco is a simulacrum, and that's really what we end up with, right? Is that our society is a simulacrum of the real thing, and that's so. Yes, you can create a simulacrum of the real thing, but it isn't the real thing. Yeah, and you can make it technically proficient, but it still isn't the real thing. And there is, and I mean, like you even see today in terms of high-end goods, right? You can get factory-made chairs, but what do people want for their living rooms? or their dining room sets. You want handmade Mennonite furniture, and you're willing to pay a premium. We just bought one of these, we just bought a sort of, an heirloom Mennonite furniture dining room set for an exorbitant amount of money for our dining room. You would not believe how much individual chairs cost. It's brutal. But we had, like, through much of our married life, machine made chairs and tables and so forth, and they're perfectly functional. But there's a certain beauty to having handmade goods, right? There's an authenticity to them that you just sort of feel in the goods themselves. It's a felt thing in many ways, right? But in society, so you can create a simulacrum that is very, very close to, and has some of the feel of the original, but it's still a simulacrum. And so for all of its imperfections, and this is the kind of thing, right? Its lumpiness is that, this village runs really well. Then the village down the road is a complete what show. Yeah. And then the village down the road is somewhere in between. And, it's very people dependent. And
that's that was kind acceptable.
That was not tolerable for the merchant classes as they were ascending, because standardization, predictable outcomes. Yeah. And I say to people all the time that, in the work that I do, that, far more than, any government policy, this way, that way, even if the effects are negative, as long as they're consistent, people can deal with what's consistent. So the business world likes a consistent environment because it's predictable. And that's really, so even if the environment is mediocre, a predictable mediocre environment is better than one that's volatile, potentially great, potentially terrible, and can change on a dime. The business community doesn't like that. They want predictable outcomes. And so the world has to be kind of managed into a kind of a bland predictability. And you can't allow that kind of lumpiness of real organic communities, because it's just intolerable to sort of the managerial mind.
So you have to find that lumpiness, or that lumpiness is created somewhere.
That's kind of the thing, is finding, is rediscovering that lumpiness again, and allowing, and it's like, there's no easy solutions. Like, there's nothing easy about any of this. And this, I say to people, like, you're not even really looking at a solution, because the quote unquote, the very idea of a solution is managerial. Yeah. Right. And so this is kind of where we're at, that we can talk about it and you can say, like, well, there is no solution. You just find really good people who are devout believers, put them in a community for 3-4 generations, let them form a real society, and then see what happens. Yeah, but I mean, even then, though, these people still have to deal with a world. They can't get away from a technological world, so they have to be able to. How do they deal with technology, the tank problem, without becoming subservient to the technical mindset again? That's really, maybe that's more so the key of how can you embrace a kind of lumpy traditional society while recognizing that the knowledge of technique and technology is not going away.
Do you find that people are kind of moving in that direction in the circles that you operate in? Like, yes, realizing I think stuff in a practical way?
People are understanding the task ahead. But like me, I think what we want, I think people can sense it, feel it in that regard. There's memories of it wired into us, I think. But the idea, what does instantiating it look like? And I don't think anybody has a really good answer for that right now. And I'm okay with that. Yeah. But I think right now we're at a phase, and this, I think, although we want to do stuff and make stuff happen, I think we're still in the understanding the problem phase. Just look at the recent dust-ups over, the quote-unquote mid-century consensus, right? Yeah. And, how should we look at Churchill's role? Like, we're at a point yet where we cannot examine the role of World War II as a historical event. It has to be a mythic contest between good and evil that now determines all of our policy things of never again. And we can't ask a whole series of questions. Well, if there's a whole series of questions that determine the current state of things about which you're not allowed to ask questions, you're not really ready to begin to grapple with meaningful solutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you can start, but like,
yeah, well, you have to be, coded.
You can see the way it's tearing things up within the Christian community now too. Like, you have people who are committed to a basic, like conservative people who are committed to a basic worldview that's built on that, post-war consensus.
Yeah.
And have
it's
thought
really
of themselves as
difficult
it's
to
really
question
difficult
whether or not we should have anything to do with Ukraine, let alone Israel.
That's right. And can
because
we look
because their vision of America includes the entire world.
That's right. And can we look at what happened in Germany and World War II from a historical perspective and learn lessons from it without necessarily turning it into a mythological battle between good and evil, where we have instantiated a new Satan figure? Can he just be a historical figure in time who is important and worthwhile to study, but not necessarily does he have to determine our actions today? Can we just look at an event as just like, just snip in terms of that? Yeah.
Well, I think the escalation of the rhetoric against Trump has actually done a lot to discredit the power of Hitler as an icon. And then the next question for people to grapple with after saying, okay, all the liberals have is this Hitler rhetoric, is to say, why do we have such a hard, or why is it so easy for us to think of any sort of strong leader as inherently evil? Like, what is our problem with authority? And should we re-examine our role or our relationship to authority to include perhaps more nuance?
Oh yeah. Well, because we mentioned, the system has actually basically been designed to cut authority out of the system. Like, we see all authority as authoritarian, right?
Yeah.
The idea, and this is where Schmidt talked about when he gets into the exception, right? Is the idea of the miracle of law. He says at some point, and this goes back to maybe like Old Testament wisdom tradition. And I think I've used this example, that from Proverbs 26, 4 and 5, the two back-to-back verses, do not correct a fool or you'll be drawn into his folly.
Yes.
And the very next verse says, correct a fool or he will forever remain in his folly. So what do? Well, the man of authority, when he meets the fool, he stands before God. He sees with eyes that are that God allows him to see, and in the moment, in his wisdom, he then knows the right path to take.
Yeah.
But the policy and procedures regime is designed to prevent that kind of uncertainty. Because what if the man who's in the position of wisdom really actually isn't wise? Yeah. Then you have a problem. So we can substitute for wisdom. We can substitute policy for wisdom. Yeah. And so, but what Schmidt argues is eventually that system comes into a situation where the rules can't figure out an answer.
Yeah.
And so
where everybody's a fool.
That's right. And he argues that the old position of the king was, in a sense, where does law come from? It's in a sense design, in a sense almost divinely inspired. It's a miracle. It just emerges from the person of the king. He just declares law and it comes into being, the miracle of law. So you have a person who's on the one hand under law, right? But yet at the same time outside of law. And so this is the thing that we as, we can't abide this person who seems to stand outside of the law. And so any figure that stands outside of the law represents a potential threat to the system, and he has to be brought back under law and made subordinate to the system again.
Well, and what follows from that is rules replacing law. There's no such thing as law anymore, or rules. There's no such thing as judges. There's experts, and the whole Brown, that Supreme Court justice who couldn't answer or would not answer what a woman is. It wasn't just about the woman question. It was about she's deferring to the expert. So there's something outside of the law called knowledge or science or the experts that then inform the law. So even the law is subjugated to rule and to peer review.
It's an admission. It's an admission that you, in a sense, you almost end up in kind of an infinite regression, right?
There's no authority.
Well, there's no authority. And the thing is that the things that we're supposed to confer authority, like quote unquote, the science or the credential,
Yeah.
people realize that they don't confer real authority. And this was essentially the argument that like Augusto Del Noce was making, is that the crisis of authority is real. And this is where he gets into his, what he called ontology, or ontologism, is the sense that where does real authority come from? And ultimately real authority comes from, in a sense, on high, that you encounter, it's sort of the metaphysical. And so Del Noce argued that within the Christian faith, and he's a Catholic, so he's thinking within the Catholic Church, there's this living tradition. But the living tradition is not the tradition itself, but it's actually the encounter with divine, with being itself, with God. And that in this encounter with God, within a living tradition, you then have the generative stuff, the ontology. You have the material with which you can then pronounce with authority on various stuff. So you can declare that here's what we need to do, or this is the way things are. This is how we should understand things. And then you, as a man of wisdom, then are respected and people accept you. And we want those types of authority. And this is the problem with the world, is not the problem authority, is that we have terrible authority, and that our authority, that the authorities that we have are terrible, and they don't actually want to be in charge of anything. They actually want to defer to the policy. Well, we decided in the committee this, or the policy isn't that, and nobody actually wants to take responsibility for anything. Yeah. And so
everybody wants power, but nobody wants responsibility.
Wants to take responsibility. They want to manage things, but they don't want responsibility for things. They want to, use power obliquely.
Yeah.
Somebody just hit print. That's the thing about a networked printer. So if you're hearing that in the background, that's what you're hearing.
Zippy, zippy, zoo. Yeah.
There we
go.
So
what, to kind of land the plane, as they say.
Yeah.
What practices in your life enable you to connect with that which is wisdom?
Okay, so this is, I was going to say,
is it following your wife's decree and buying that hand-built furniture? Is that what gives you contact with the real?
That was probably my idea, but yeah, no, actually, and I think here's the thing, and it's probably going to, but I would think that, and I've said this before, but perhaps the most subversive thing that you can do as a political dissident in many ways, is to actually pray and connect with God in that regard. So, delve into the traditions of, scripture, the traditions, but mostly is just to draw yourself close to God and to pray. Because that, in a sense, because if that is really the source, and we're talking the source of wisdom and authority, then the way that you put yourself into being a man of authority is to draw yourself close to God. And then if God finds you trustworthy, that's basically what the story of Abraham going up the mount with the sacrifice of Isaac is, this a sense of where God finds Abraham trustworthy. There's a whole series of vision and finding wisdom. Abraham, wants God to look at him, see me, behold me, I'm answering you. And then, on the mount of, the Lord, there is wisdom, or there is sight, right? So Abraham goes up the mountain, gains his sight, in part because he's been deemed trustworthy by God to be able to see. So there is this sense of, and these are like the very ancient ideas of how you gain wisdom and authority. And we live in a sinful world, and so corruption happens. And this is one of the reasons why the policy and procedures kind of manual, the American Constitution, is because you're trying to, through system, to protect humanity from sinful human beings and overcome that. I mean, they don't talk about sin because everybody's born a blank slate, but I mean, everybody kind of implicitly recognizes that there's evil in the world and it has to be dealt with, but its causes and origins. But that aside, despite the fact that there's various qualities of people, and people get the pathway to that kind of wisdom remains the same. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So you go up the mountain, you're tested by God, and if God sees you as worthy, you gain your sight. And that's kind of, so like I said to people, that if you really, and this is for, I think, not just like religious and spiritual, but guys who would say, even want to re-engage what you might call the warrior caste as sort of the if you look at this at the cycle of cultural development, that it generally begins with a warrior caste, alongside with a priestly caste. But the warrior caste were an embodiment of the spiritual values of the people. So, in this regard, a warrior who prays, right? So that's that kind of, so there is a sense, I think, even if you want to embrace the values as the word is, to do so as a man of prayer. And I think there is something that even a technologized church can't technologize away, is your willingness to sort of, in a sense, get on your knee and pray. And it sounds, I know for many, maybe in your audience, whatever, it's going to sound wild and crazy, but that to me, I think, is probably the most dissident thing that you can do, is to pray.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the way to solve the Costco test too,
Probably. Yeah.
Yeah. Kruptos, where can people find you, and what are they going to find when they get there?
Well, they can find me on Twitter @_Kruptos. And Twitter is a mix of stuff. It's serious. It's fun. Sometimes you can't take Twitter too seriously, although I tend to do more so these days. But the bulk of what I do in terms of writing happens over on my Substack at seekingthehiddenthing.com. That's seekingthehiddenthing.com, just the way it sounds. And
almost
I haven't
all of
written
your
anything.
articles are spoken too, so people can listen.
That's right. So you can download them too. Now there is some paid content because this takes time away from the family, and the wife likes it better when there's a little bit of remuneration for it. So it doesn't pay the bills, but it does blunt it, so forth. So there is some paid stuff. So and your support in that way is helpful. But I do a number of different things. So I do my own writing. I have a group chat that I run of Christian men on the right, and I call it, it's named The Christian Ghetto, and I do a podcast, often bring on guys from that group chat to talk, but sometimes outside guests. And that's not always consistent. It's intermediate. Whenever, I don't generally do it around guests, I do it around, when do I have something interesting that I want to talk about? And then I'll record a podcast. And if I don't have something interesting to talk about, I don't record a talk. And lately, because somebody had said to me a while back that, like, I have a really good voice and you should do something with it. Maybe you should do. And so I've also been recently reading sections of scripture on my thing. And so I've got the whole Gospel of Matthew is now up in, I think, 8 or 9 segments on, I think. So I'm going to keep going with that. There hasn't been much the last week or two because I've been busy with work and sick. I fell down the stairs and whacked my ribs, and I've just been, it's been a rough couple of weeks for me. So, so here we are. So
can I ask you a theological question quickly?
Sure.
Is Paul a cool guy, or you have problems with Paul? Is Paul genuine?
Oh, no, I think Paul is wonderful.
Okay.
Part of the problem with Paul is a lot of people misread him. The thing is that we tend to want to, Paul often gets read theologically, in a sense that where people try to make him as the heart of, like, systematic theology. And one of the things that I think people don't read enough in is to see Paul as a mystic in many ways. And I would argue that in many ways, the heart of Paul's writing is very, very mystical, in a sense, the real presence of God in the lives of people. It's one of those things, unfortunately, where in the West we've tend to rationalize the faith, objectify, rationalize it, and because we've wanted to rationalize it and exact theological precision, we have in some ways missed the deep mystical side of Paul that is there. This is one thing that I would encourage people to do is reading the Old Testament is vital, and so it's really hard to understand the New Testament fully without reading the Old Testament. But if you're going to start scripture reading, what I would recommend people to do is set aside a few minutes, read, like, say, 5 chapters a day. If you do that, you go through the whole New Testament in just under 2 months. If you read 5 chapters a day, and if you were to do that for a year, 5 chapters a day, read nothing but the New Testament, you would go through the New Testament 5 times in a year, And doing that would change dramatically your understanding, because you begin to see and pick up themes, you begin to see recurring words, recurring phrases, and then the perceived differences sometimes that people have between, say, the Jesus presented in the gospel and Paul in the epistles, I find they tend to evaporate.
Okay.
That when
they resolve.
and that's kind of where you go. And so in a sense, and I have also recommended, instead of reading it sort of front to back, is to find, it doesn't matter which order, but find a list of the New Testament books in the order that they were written. And it's not necessarily like how precise it is, but just the idea. So that if you begin with James and Galatians, then you move through it, that if you start off and think to yourself like, okay, why does the theology in James not have like a developed Christology or Christology? But if you understand that the James letter was one of the first letters written, it becomes much more understandable that there's a less developed Christology in James than there is in some of the later books.
And you start to see that work as in dialogue with itself.
That's right. And also in its historical progression. Right. And so that's what I've done. I've done it both ways, where I read it through sort of in the order that they're given in the books, but I generally tend to prefer now to read it through in the historic, like the order in which they've been written historically. So that's kind of how I would recommend that way in terms of, reading your Bible.
Great. Thanks for the,
which is a terrible phrase, reading your Bible, but reading
your Bible. Yeah. Reading your Bible.
Yeah, I know. You can still see some of those evangelical kind of catchphrases that creep in.
You got, you came from a particular time, a particular people, and it's okay to just be a bit of a boomer.
Is fine. That's right. Well, and like shaking off your presuppositions again, right? Yeah. How hard it is. Yeah.
Always a pleasure. I'm going to try to get you and Paul Vanderklay in conversation at some point, maybe after the holidays.
Yeah, we'll have to do it. I mean, it's that West Coast, East Coast thing, and he's busy.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, everybody's busy. So thank you so much for your afternoon.
No, it's a pleasure. It's always a delight, Ben. Always a delight. So.
Description. Well, it's my honor and your delight. So there we go. Fair trade. All right. Cool.